Can I have all of the amazing panelists turn their cameras on as we begin to have a dialogue now that you've shared these incredible pearls of wisdom and shared your journeys with us. I learned so much about each of you. And we work together a lot. And I learned so much about each of you every time I learn new things. It's just more and more just humbled and impressed. So I am going to leave it up to Sarah to help me moderate the Q&A through the chat. And I am just going to start with one of the questions for our amazing panelists that I prepared with. If I could find it here in my notes. So each one of you have had these amazing lived experiences. And I wonder, you know, you've had these formative experiences as well to start the conversation that drew you to science and drew you to activism, right? Your families, your world around you. How have these lived experiences influenced your professional journeys and the ways that you now operate in these orbits? And I'll start with Aradhana.
Yeah, so I think those experiences really are seminal, really, to shaping who I am and how I approach what I do. You know, there's so many lessons to be had in reflection and in contextualizing. Why is it that I'm here, given that I see so much in so many of the students that I meet, and when I learn about the scale, and I think about the traumas that I experienced, my family experienced, and I learn about the scale of these issues in this country, you know, those were experiences that felt so isolating. Having a parent who's incarcerated, having a person who's homeless, who's sleeping rough, you know, and that's just kind of scratching the surface of those things. And then to learn about the impacts, the psychological impacts that has, the statistics for kids who, you know, children of color in this country who have a parent who is incarcerated, the impacts on mental health, ADD, ADHD, and that in turn makes me also appreciate why it is that I view systems the way that I do, and why I, you know, touch things in the way that I do, and that those are, the, you know, all of those formative experiences together are why I am who I am, and they make me the scientist that I am and the human being that I am. You know, and so
absolutely, and I see some of this built into
that when I engage with our students and they're coming to terms with their, you know, perspectives on their histories, their experiences, the narratives that they encounter from professors, from their peers, and wanting them to see that actually these are their superpowers, right? As you put it, Catalina. And I think it's so important for people to see that actually, that this is all part of what makes us who we are. And we have to find ways to be able to view that as being okay. And I also say that, you know, things like depression, anxiety, ADD, ADHD, those are things that we do. We are trying to be healthy in an environment and in systems that are not healthy. These are the healthy responses, actually, to recognizing that things in your environment are not constructed in ways that are healthy for you. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Aradhana. And I see a lot of that built into the framework that you operate from with CDLS. So thank you so much for all that you do. And Lisa, talk to us about how you bring this into your orbit and the way that you operate as well, your lived experiences.
Well, when I changed positions 9 years ago, so I was very comfortable at San Francisco State. It was my alma mater, my parents' alma mater, live in San Francisco. And maybe I would have been a dean by now. I don't know, but there was something that was missing. And when Berkeley encouraged me to apply for the position I have now, Director of Education Outreach at the Museum of Paleontology, there was some initial hesitancy. I have enough Cal alumni in my family, and know as a longtime supporter of public education in California, what I was getting into there, the most elite of the public universities. So I wasn't sure that was the direction for me, but there was something about being able to focus my energies on broader impacts, community partnerships, professional development, that was very attractive. And so this, reluctant activist thought, if I can get on that stage in a university that's likely to push back, on some things, yet 20 years into my profession, how much am I going to let that bother me at this point? So maybe it is the right time to really push. And so it's been professionally rewarding, even with the challenges, and even with trying to straddle all these different disciplines, paleontology, bringing research interests I have in ocean science and new partnerships with the International Ocean Discovery Program, and with programs like STEM-SEAS, which take advantage of vessels in the UNOS fleet to take undergraduates out on ships. And there's been a really interesting coming together of programs in a position now where I can really focus on education and outreach and broader impacts. I don't have a teaching obligation, and when I do instruct, it's typically a graduate seminar or professional development workshop. And there's something about just going on and taking a risk, even when it seems like the opportunity may not quite be the right one at the right time, you just make it the right one. And so I find that I do have, more energy to be involved with the professional societies like AGU. I mean, 30 years a member, and was never on a committee or involved in a leadership way in the various sections and divisions. And so I think listening to, those calls to action has really guided me to the place where I can work with Vernon and Aradhna, and of course you, Catalina, and the family, as we refer to our extended network. And so while there were some doubters saying, well, you're supposed to just stay, on this same professional line and ascend to, whatever's above. I do have a sister. My oldest sister is a college president at DePauw University in Indiana, but we joke, I'm not trying to be her. She's not trying to be me, can't find her way around the lab, but we have a lot of fun as a family, supporting each other and being very active in the education of a lot of young folks. So.
Absolutely. And, there's a cost to a lot of those stretch opportunities and to step outside of that lane, right? And so, Vernon, I'd love for you to speak to that, how your lived experiences and those formative years that you were such an activist, right? And coming from a family of activists, and throughout your journey, your long journey, Vernon, I know that you end up having to pay this tax, right? There's this culture tax, we call it, for having the audacity to hope and to stretch and to step outside of the spaces that you're expected to be in. So talk to us about that. I know you all are in this, really powerful space now, but what did it take to get there? What did you have to pay to get there, right?
No, it's a great question. And by the way, I know where you live, Kat, so I'm coming to get you after this. You do pay for it. And I have to credit my upbringing really instilled a very oppositional attitude in me. And so as much as I enjoy science, I love science. And this was probably the only, outside of, actually boxing or something like that, this is probably the career that's ideal for me, that I get to pursue the things that I really love to do. and that I have passion for. But, you know, the choices to be an activist, to work at an HBCU, those are serious costs because of sort of white supremacist views of who gets to do science, and whose science is credible and whose science is quality. And, you know, when you raise questions about, hey, why can't we be more inclusive? The first thing that people fire back at is, oh, we're going to lower standards. As if I said, hey, let's lower standards. Like that's the thing that I actually said. And so then you pay for it. You pay for it by not being invited. You know, your access to information gets cut off. Your access to recognition gets cut off. Certainly your access to resources. If you look at the resource differentials and investment in minority serving institutions versus even small state universities. And even if you look at the HBCU state universities, we just won a huge lawsuit, multi-decadal lawsuit, just to get what they were owed from the legislation in North Carolina and Maryland and Virginia. It's a very serious professional tax, and what it typically does is it runs people out of the field. It runs people out of the careers, or it shuts down individuals who could have probably created, you know, world-changing science. There's a beautiful paper in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science on the diversity innovation paradox, where it's a multi-decadal study of PhD theses of grad students of color, and how much more innovative their approaches were, how much more holistic they were, and also how excluded they were from careers in the academy. And
It's incredible.
that you get out of the system that you love. And so there's, you know, I have to credit, you know, Howard University, at least to the extent that it was a haven for me to recruit other exceptional scholars, Puerto Rican students, African-American students, Mexican-American students, create an environment where people could thrive despite the barriers. You know, there's this unicornification of the people of color who get through this, that you have to be magical to make it out the other side almost. And I think that proposition has been held up too long. And I think you don't have to be magical if you go to if you go to somebody's institution. You don't have to do all this other stuff. You can just, you know, get through if you're, you know, if you have the right privilege. And so that's actually been some of my inspiration to keep going. You know, and I'm thankful that I have an oppositional personality.
So are we.
but you know, it's a lot of students, a lot of professionals aren't willing to risk that, because there is huge risk. My daughter was born when I was in grad school.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking, okay, well, yeah, I guess I got to leave school if this doesn't work out, but I'm going to survive because, you know, I don't have a choice. And, you know, I did survive, but that was, you know, I look back and I don't remember thinking about, you know, sort of fretting each day about how I was going to do what I needed to do. It was just, this is what I got to do.
Yeah.
And so when people ask me now, how did you do that? I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. That was my life. And, you know, like day to day, you know, is how you do it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, you know, the isolation that you had then, you know, I'm really happy to see how many coalitions and, you know, connections and affinity groups and resources that students have right now. And if they can just connect to those, that can help them be successful, because that is the major change that has happened. You know, when they said it hasn't been very much change. Nah, if when you're like one of only 2 African Americans studying atmospheric sciences in the nation, and you look at it now, yeah, it's a big change actually. Now, have attitudes changed enough? No. You know, have
Yeah.
structures changed enough? No.
Right.
But there's been a change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us, Dr. Morris. And I have so many follow-on questions that I'm going to have to hold on to for the next time we all gather for drinks. But I have a question from the chat. Over both days of this event, we've heard participants acknowledge the importance of having leadership buy-in for all of these efforts, right? So based on your past experience for change in your universities or institutions, what have you learned? And what recommendations do you have for doing this from the middle or the bottom, leading from the side, leading from different spaces, leading from where you are, right? And I'll let you all respond.
I was thinking maybe Aradna would want to start with this one. I'll go after Aradna.
All right. Yeah. So it's been interesting because where I'm at, I see there being a lack of institutional support for what we're doing. Like the status quo, persists because people constantly reproducing what they think of as normal. And so it's the norm is for things to continue as they are. And with the center, with the work we're doing, we're working against the dominant cultural norms. And, instead of focusing on individualism, which is a huge part of the academy, we tend to focus on the community. We do team-based science. It's how we approach our community partnerships. Instead of viewing the university and the Western STEM departments as being the resource and the other participants as being in deficit, we take the approach of looking at the strengths of the students and the scholars and the communities we're working with, and there are deficits in the dominant culture. There's the institution has so much that reinforces this myth of meritocracy, and and there's so much from leadership about the objectiveness of science and about there being 2 sides, and it's when it comes to racism, when it comes to discrimination. So there's a lot of scaffolding of whiteness in our institutions, and leadership is responsible for the maintaining of that. So, I think we were very much we took a bottom up approach, and then also the kind of folks in the middle who are faculty who do hold power in terms of their positionality. And so, we work on kind of empowering and networking change agents. That's, part of what we do with our ecosystem of fellowship programs. We actually do a power mapping exercise. We map out departmental change agents, and we have a long-term planning effort around them. So that way, we have people who are growing their skills and practicing them with respect to equity mindedness. And we're talking about, say, at the faculty level, what this looks like with respect to mentoring, with respect to community-based work, with respect to recruitment practices, retention practices. And, we're trying to ensure that faculty are not doing this alone, but they're doing this in groups. So we're mapping out multiple people within a unit. And this was something that, education researchers that we're working with had brought to us as an approach when we were working on the collaboration with them.
Yeah, you're creating embedded change
with
agents.
The specific structure of the center, because there's the dominant institutional culture and department cultures, we created a structure that would cut across units so that we wouldn't be always swimming upstream against that dominant culture, but instead we would find community and create our own norms and culture And, you know, we have our own communications arm where we share our stories. And when people want those stories to be shared more broadly, we then share those with others. So, yeah, I think that it's great when you have institutional support. That's how programs become sustainable. It would have made our work much healthier. Um, but at the same time, we also recognize the power of utilizing our voices together and having people with different positionality within our institution pushing for policy change, amplifying each other's voices different ways. And so leadership doesn't quite know what to make of us, but we're all kind of pushing, right? And so, you know, what this looks like is like, you know, our early career fellows we have a regular town hall with them, and we hear about what they want their agenda to be for institutional transformation and the specific things they want to see. And then that steers what we do. The organizing that they're doing to open up space for themselves and others, we resource that, and we mentor. We look for people with concordant identities to serve as role models and mentors and give strategic advice. And we bring in facilitators to create workshops for, you know, for faculty and administrators around that. And so, yeah. I mean, I don't think
you,
it's
Aradhna.
going to be sustainable for very long. We've been doing this work for several years, and
Yeah.
it's not a healthy way to engage with institutional leadership. But I stay hopeful that institutional leadership will be responsive to those calls for action, and when we keep working on empowering and, you know, raising our voices and using them and showing that there are different ways to do science. I think I'm really curious to hear Lisa's stories, and then also Vernon, because you've had different institutional relationships from Howard to ASU. So, yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, between these embedded change agents that you're creating this sort of a scaffolding of support, we all also are involved with the AGU landing program, Lisa and Vernon more heavily, where they're trying to train these leaders and these change agents in the DEI AJ realm. So I don't know if one of you want to speak to that. We have about 4 minutes remaining.
Well, quick for landing, and I posted it in the chat, and yet Vernon and I and others, and Catalina, you've spoken to some of the landing scholars. But what I wanted to mention was we are all at institutions, especially Aradhna and I, that are just notorious for not even trying to break a barrier and get beyond some of the, you know, systemic nature of lack of change. And so spending more time just working with the professional societies, working within networks of individuals capable of getting resources that can focus on this need for change and in leadership, and equip professionals with some of the things they need with backing to apply some of these agents of change in, you know, an institutional structure. So in addition to the Landing Academy, which the first cohort has been very present at AGU this week, and they'll go on, I'm sure, and do big things. But on a smaller scale, I'm advising a project called All Aboard, so alliance building offshore to achieve resilience and diversity. And it's being run by two very exciting early career scholars, so Benjamin Kiesling and Raquel Bryant. They're, as if they don't have enough to do, they're finishing up postdocs, starting new faculty positions next year. They're also organizing what we're calling the second national conference. So 2022 is the 50th anniversary of the very first meeting of the mind. So leadership that was mostly all men, mostly white, in 1972, gathered together in Golden, Colorado to discuss why there wasn't more diversity in geoscience and make a plan. So of course the plan reads like something out of, you know, a 2021 guide on what you need to do for diversity. So they're bringing individuals together. But I mentioned this All Aboard program because it's very much designed with cohorts in mind that include administrators, faculty, graduate students from a single department, and therefore universities that will be part of this first series of departmental team building opportunities. And we're going to do our workshops, one of our workshops on a ship, because we know of the kinds of environments and positive things that can happen, when you're all on a ship for some amount of time. So yeah, so those programs give me quite a bit of hope at future change.
Oh, you all give me so much hope, and we're out of time, but Sam just gave us another 2 minutes, Vernon, for you to talk a little bit about No Time for Silence, which we did just share the link to in the chat. So please enlighten us about No Time for Silence, Dr. Vernon Morris.
I'll give you maybe a quick 30 seconds on two things. But No Time for Silence. No Time for Silence was one of the calls, mini calls that came out in 2020, and something that had been sort of boiling up for some time, but it came out, and I think what many commonalities between a number of the other calls, but the focus in No Time for Silence was really on institutional and organizational change. There's a lot of focus on the workshops that train bystanders and train allies and train people to understand implicit bias or explicit bias. But those can fall into a comfort zone of trying to make small tweaks on a system that is faulty. And so those small tweaks are not going to disrupt the system itself. Audre Lorde talks about the master's tools, not going to take down the master's house. And so it's almost as if you're going to put on a new coat of paint on the master's house, it's still going to be the master's house. So No Time for Silence was really about trying to get prescriptive on the types of organizational and structural changes that the different sectors needed to make. And we're about to put on some very specific recommendations. We've been in contact, again, putting people in places that can influence how AGU does business. And AGU is one of the first professional organizations to really look at No Time for Silence, engage No Time for Silence leadership, and start to make changes within the organization. AMS is starting to follow. We've had of the major science mission agencies, new programs coming out actually this year that have stemmed from some of those conversations, and some of the placement of individuals who are willing to be activist voices on these highest level advisory boards. And so I think it's that type of change that needs to happen. I'm in a position now where I can issue challenges to the president of the university because he asked for that from faculty. And if you ask, I'll be right there. But he's
or
also
even if you don't ask.
Yeah. You don't get you get what you ask for when you don't ask. But he's invested in some new programs to bring in 50 postdocs of color a year, 50 graduate students of color a year. He's empowered us to design a new recruitment retention success model for Black faculty that'll be translational. It will need some tweaks and some unique aspects for Indigenous faculty, Latinx faculty, but here's resources to develop this model that will change how we do business at the university. And yes, it needs more resources. And yes, universities are notorious for death by committee. Here, let's form a committee to do whatever, and then that committee will spawn another committee and committee. But we, I think, have a slight difference now in that we have the resources to enact change, to implement programs, to incentivization and account structures for production and tenure in our units. And I think those are the changes that we need to make that are going to have the generational effects on structure. So
thank you so much, Vernon. And for those of you who aren't familiar with No Time for Silence, I really hope that you'll go to that link and see that this powerful coalition also put out specific recommendations to federal institutions such as NOAA And so they've been very action oriented. And so I just want to thank our incredible panelists for joining us today and for sharing so much incredible information. And I want to thank the Come In team for allowing us to assemble this way and to have these conversations.